Hello, dear friends. My name is Margaret and I'm 75 years old. What I'm about to share with you isn't easy to tell, but it's a story that needs to be heard. Sometimes life has a peculiar way of bringing things full circle, and today as I sit in this quiet house, caring for the man who once left me to face death alone, I realize that perhaps everything happened exactly as it was meant to. The morning light filters through the curtains as I prepare his medication. Pills arranged in neat rows, water glass positioned just so. He's sleeping in the hospital bed we had delivered last month, his breathing labored but steady. This is Harold, my ex-husband of 43 years. The same man who walked out of my life when I needed him most is now completely dependent on me for his very survival. You might wonder why I took him in. His children from his second marriage couldn't cope, they said. The care facilities were too expensive, they claimed. But honestly, I think they saw what I once failed to see. That Harold had become a shell of the man who once commanded respect and admiration. When his daughter called me 6 months ago, her voice trembling with desperation, asking if I might consider, well, I surprised even myself by saying yes. Margaret, she had whispered into the phone, you're the only one he asks for. Even now, even after everything, your name is the only one that brings him peace. As I adjust his blanket now, watching this frail man who was once so proud, so certain of his own importance, I feel something I never expected. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but a deep, quiet understanding. Life has a way of teaching lessons that no amount of anger or bitterness ever could. And the secret I've carried all these years, the truth that changed everything I thought I knew about love and family, has finally found its purpose in this unexpected chapter of our story. The irony isn't lost on me. The woman he abandoned for being too weak, too needy, too broken, is now his lifeline. But this isn't about justice or karma. It's about something much more profound that I'm still learning to understand. I was 22 when I first saw Harold across the crowded church social hall in 1972. He was 25, tall and confident, with dark hair that caught the light and a smile that seemed to promise the world. I had grown up on a small farm outside town, the youngest of 4 daughters. My parents were simple people. My father worked the land, my mother tended the house, and us girls with equal devotion. We didn't have much, but we had love, laughter, and the certainty that family meant everything. I had just started working as a secretary at the local bank, proud of my neat handwriting and my ability to balance the books to the penny. I wore my best blue dress that evening, the one my mother had sewn for my high school graduation. I remember feeling grown up and hopeful, ready for whatever life might bring. Harold approached me during the coffee hour, his confidence both intimidating and thrilling. He was studying to be an accountant, he told me, had big plans for his future. He spoke of the house he would build, the life he would create, with such certainty that I found myself drawn into his vision like a moth to flame. You're different from the other girls, he told me on our third date as we walked along the creek behind my family's property. You're genuine. I can see myself building something lasting with someone like you. I fell in love not just with Harold but with the future he painted for us. We courted for 2 years properly, with Sunday dinners at my parents' house and long conversations about our dreams. He loved my mother's cooking, charmed my father with his knowledge of farming economics, and made my sisters giggle with his gentle teasing. Our wedding in the spring of 1974 was small but perfect. I wore my mother's dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried wildflowers from our meadow. Harold looked so handsome in his new suit, and when he promised to love me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, I believed with my whole heart that we would face whatever came together. The early years were golden. Harold finished his studies and found work at a prestigious firm in the city. We bought a modest house with a white picket fence and a garden where I planted roses. I continued working at the bank, and together we saved every penny, planning for the family we both wanted so desperately. Those evenings when he would come home and find me in the kitchen, humming as I prepared dinner, he would wrap his arms around me from behind and whisper, "This is perfect, Margaret. This is exactly what I dreamed of." And I believed him. I believed we were building something beautiful and lasting, something that would withstand any storm. By our 3rd year of marriage, the subject of children began to weigh heavily on both our hearts. Every month that passed without the blessing we hoped for felt like a small failure. I would catch Harold looking at families in church with a longing that matched my own, and I began to feel the terrible pressure of disappointing the man I loved more than life itself. The doctors assured us there was nothing wrong, that we simply needed to be patient. "These things happen in God's time," they would say with practiced kindness. But as our friends welcomed their first, then second children and family gatherings became increasingly difficult to endure, I began to see subtle changes in Harold that frightened me. He grew quieter during dinner, less interested in my stories from work. When his sister announced her third pregnancy, I watched his face crumble for just a moment before he composed himself and offered congratulations. That night he held me with a desperation that felt more like grief than love. "Maybe we're being punished for something," I whispered into the darkness, voicing the fear that had been growing in my heart. "Don't be ridiculous, Margaret," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "These things just happen." I threw myself into making our home perfect, thinking that if I could just be a better wife, cook better meals, keep a cleaner house, somehow that would be enough. I learned to bake bread from scratch, planted vegetables in neat rows, and made sure Harold's shirts were pressed to perfection. But perfection, I was learning, couldn't fill the ache of empty bedrooms. The pressure from outside grew too. Harold's mother, never one to hold her tongue, began making pointed comments about God's plan, and suggesting perhaps we should accept our lot in life. My own mother, bless her heart, tried to comfort me with stories of couples who had children after 10, 15, even 20 years of marriage. But her optimism felt increasingly hollow as each month brought the same disappointment. Harold began working longer hours. "Providing for our future," he called it, but I sensed he was avoiding the quiet sadness that had settled over our home like dust on forgotten furniture. When he did come home, he was tired, distracted, and somehow unreachable despite sitting right beside me. I started volunteering at the church nursery, thinking that caring for other people's children might ease the ache. Instead, it only highlighted what I couldn't give to the man I loved. I would come home with baby powder still on my clothes and the lingering scent of innocence, and Harold would look at me with a mixture of pity and something else I was afraid to name. The conversations about our future grew shorter, less hopeful. We stopped making plans for nurseries or discussing names. Instead, we existed in a strange limbo, going through the motions of a happy marriage while something essential slowly withered between us. I began to wonder if Harold looked at me differently now, if when he saw other men with their children he felt cheated somehow. The confident, loving man who had promised to build a life with me was slowly being replaced by someone distant and disappointed, and I was terrified that I was the reason why. The truth revealed itself on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 7 years into our marriage. I had left work early with a headache and came home to find Harold's car in the driveway beside another I didn't recognize. As I approached our front door, I heard laughter. His laughter, warm and genuine in a way I hadn't heard in months. I stood frozen on my own porch, key in hand, as the reality washed over me. The woman's voice was young, melodic, filled with the kind of joy I used to bring to Harold's world. They were in our living room, on our sofa, and she was telling him about her day at the elementary school where she taught. She spoke of the children with such natural ease, such obvious maternal instinct, that I understood immediately why Harold had been drawn to her. I backed away from the door and sat in my car for 2 hours, watching and waiting. When she finally emerged, I saw everything I was not: young, vibrant, easily pregnant with the future Harold wanted. She kissed him goodbye on our front steps with the casual intimacy of someone who belonged there, who had every right to his love and attention. That evening, Harold came home as if nothing had happened. He asked about my headache, commented on dinner, and read his newspaper while I washed dishes with hands that couldn't stop trembling. For 3 weeks I said nothing. I watched my husband live 2 lives, and I watched myself disappear a little more each day. Finally, I couldn't bear the pretense any longer. "Her name is Linda," I said quietly one evening as we sat in our living room. Harold's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened around it. "Margaret, She teaches children. She's young. She's pregnant, isn't she?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When Harold finally looked at me, his face held no denial, no surprise, just a terrible kind of relief that the charade was over. "Yes," he whispered. She's 3 months along. The words hit me like physical blows. 3 months. While I had been volunteering in the church nursery, longing for a child of our own, Harold had been creating the family he wanted with someone else. How long? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. A year. Margaret, I never meant for this to happen. She makes me feel alive again. Hopeful. Like the man I used to be. The accusation was clear in his words. I had made him feel dead, hopeless, less than the man he wanted to be. My inability to give him children had driven him to find someone who could. I'm moving out, he said, the words rehearsed, prepared. Linda needs me now. The baby needs a father. I hope you can understand. I sat there as my marriage dissolved around me, as the life I had built with such care and devotion crumbled into dust. Harold packed his belongings that very night, moving with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for months. As he stood in our doorway for the last time, suitcase in hand, he turned back to me. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm sorry you couldn't be what I needed. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow contained the sound of my entire world ending. I was 31 years old, and the only man I had ever loved had just told me that my greatest failure was simply being myself. The first month after Harold left was the longest of my life. I moved through our empty house like a ghost, touching things that still held his presence. The coffee cup he favored, the chair where he read his evening paper, the indent in the mattress where he used to sleep. Everything reminded me of what I had lost, what I had apparently never deserved to keep. My mother came to stay with me those first weeks, bringing casseroles and comfort, holding me while I cried until there were no tears left. You're stronger than you know, sweetheart, she would whisper into my hair. This isn't the end of your story. It's just the end of this chapter. I didn't believe her then. How could I? At 31, I felt ancient, used up, discarded. All my friends were busy with their growing families, their intact marriages. I felt like a cautionary tale, proof that love wasn't always enough, that wanting something desperately didn't guarantee you'd receive it. But slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. I had to. The alternative was disappearing entirely, and somewhere deep inside I found I wasn't ready to give up on life just because Harold had given up on me. I threw myself into work at the bank, arriving early and staying late. Numbers didn't judge me or find me lacking. Ledgers balanced or they didn't. There was no ambiguity, no wondering if I was somehow insufficient. My supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, noticed my dedication and began giving me additional responsibilities. For the first time in years, I felt competent, valuable. You have a gift for this, she told me one afternoon as I presented a particularly complex financial analysis. Have you ever considered pursuing formal training in accounting? The suggestion terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Accounting was Harold's field, his expertise. But it was also something I had always understood intuitively, something that made sense to me in a way that emotional relationships apparently didn't. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, studying bookkeeping and business mathematics. The classroom was filled with other women like me. Some divorced, some widowed, all of us learning to navigate a world that hadn't prepared us for independence. We formed an unlikely sisterhood, sharing textbooks and encouragement, studying together in coffee shops and living rooms. For the first time since Harold left, I felt part of something larger than my own grief. I moved out of the house Harold and I had shared, unable to afford the mortgage alone and unwilling to live surrounded by the ghosts of our marriage. I found a small apartment above the bakery on Main Street. It was tiny but bright, with windows that let in morning sun and the comforting scent of bread baking below. I learned to cook for one, discovered that I actually enjoyed the solitude I had once feared. I bought plants and watched them grow, proof that I could nurture something successfully. I read books Harold had dismissed as frivolous, listened to music he had considered too sentimental. Slowly, I began to remember who Margaret was before she became Harold's wife. The divorce was finalized on a gray February morning. Harold's lawyer was efficient and cold, dividing our modest possessions with clinical precision. Harold didn't attend the proceedings. He was busy, his lawyer explained, with his new baby daughter. The words stung, but less than they would have months earlier. By then, I had learned that survival required building calluses around the tender places in your heart. 3 years after Harold left, I was promoted to assistant manager at the bank. I had my own small office, my own responsibilities, my own sense of purpose. I wasn't the woman I had planned to be, but I was becoming someone I could respect. Life has a way of testing us when we think we found our footing. I was 38 when the doctor spoke the word that changes everything. Cancer. Breast cancer, caught early enough to be treatable but serious enough to require surgery, chemotherapy, and months of uncertainty. I sat in that sterile office, listening to treatment options and survival statistics, and the first person I thought of was Harold. Not because I expected anything from him, but because facing mortality makes you remember everyone who was supposed to love you unconditionally. I had built a good life in the 7 years since our divorce. I had friends from work, from my neighborhood, from the book club I had joined on a whim. But when the doctor asked about my support system, about who would be there to help me through treatment, I realized how alone I really was. My parents were aging, my father's health already fragile. My sisters lived in other states, busy with their own families. The friends I had made were good people, but our relationships were built on shared interests and pleasant conversations, not the deep bonds that carry you through crisis. I decided not to tell Harold. What would be the point? He had made his choices clear years ago. I was no longer his responsibility, no longer someone he needed to worry about. Pride, perhaps, or maybe just a realistic understanding of who he had become. Instead, I told my supervisor at the bank, arranged for leave, and prepared to face this battle alone. But I underestimated the kindness of ordinary people, the way communities form around those in need. Mrs. Patterson from the apartment below mine appeared at my door the evening before my first surgery, carrying a pot of soup and a determined expression. "I know we don't know each other well," she said, "but I lost my sister to this disease 3 years ago. I know what the fight looks like, and nobody should face it alone." She became my champion, recruiting neighbors and co-workers into a quiet army of support. Someone drove me to treatments when I was too weak to manage alone. Someone else did my grocery shopping, bringing bags of food to my door with gentle insistence that I needed to keep my strength up. The ladies from my book club took turns calling to check on me, their voices bright with determined optimism. Tom Anderson from the bank visited every weekend, bringing flowers from his garden and updates from the office. "We need you back," he would say with gruff kindness. "The new girl they hired can't balance a checkbook to save her life." Through the long months of treatment, through the fear and weakness and uncertainty, I learned something profound about love. Real love, it turned out, wasn't about grand promises or passionate declarations. It was about showing up, day after day, with soup and flowers and telephone calls. It was about ordinary people choosing to care for someone who had no claim on their time or attention except shared humanity. Harold never called, never sent a card, never asked about my health through the few mutual acquaintances we still shared. His silence was complete, and somehow that made his absence easier to bear. I had stopped expecting anything from him long ago. But his absence also revealed something important. I had learned to live without him. More than that, I had learned to thrive without him. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through marriage and the hope of motherhood had discovered she was capable of so much more. When I finally returned to work, thin but cancer-free, my colleagues threw a small celebration. As I looked around at their faces, people who had chosen to care for me, to include me in their definition of family, I realized that Harold's abandonment had been the greatest gift he could have given me. It had forced me to discover my own strength, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. I was no longer the woman who had begged him to stay. I was someone entirely new, someone who had faced death and chosen life, who had been loved and supported not because of what I could give, but simply because I was worth caring about. 25 years passed. I built a career that brought me satisfaction and respect, rising to become head of loan operations at the bank. I bought a small house with a garden where I grew tomatoes and roses with equal success. I traveled, modest trips, but adventures nonetheless, to places Harold had always dismissed as impractical or expensive. I dated occasionally, even had a few serious relationships, but I never remarried. I had learned to love my solitude, to value my independence too much to compromise it for anything less than extraordinary love. And extraordinary love, I had discovered, was rarer than I had once believed. I was 68 when the phone call came. Harold's daughter Sarah, now 34 herself, called on a Tuesday evening in March. Her voice was strained, uncertain. "Margaret, this is Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Harold's daughter." I remembered her as a toddler in Harold's arms at the grocery store years ago, both of us pretending not to see each other. Now she was a grown woman with problems too large for her to handle alone. "He's sick," she said without preamble. "Dad is very sick. Lung cancer advanced. The doctors say, well, they say he doesn't have long." I listened to her explain the situation with growing amazement. Harold's second wife, Linda, had left him 5 years earlier when his business failed and his health began declining. His son from that marriage lived across the country and rarely visited. Sarah, struggling with 2 young children and a husband who traveled constantly for work, had been trying to care for Harold alone. "He keeps asking for you," she said, her voice breaking. "Even now, even after everything, your name is the only one that seems to calm him down. The nursing home is so expensive and he hates it there. He cries, Margaret. My father cries and asks for you." The irony was staggering. The man who had left me because I was too weak, too needy, was now weak and needy himself, asking for the woman he had once discarded. "I know I have no right to ask this," Sarah continued. "I know what he did to you is terrible. But you're the only one he wants, and we don't know what else to do." I should have said no. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I owed Harold nothing, that his current suffering was not my responsibility. But as I listened to this young woman, his daughter, who had done nothing wrong, struggle with an impossible situation, I found myself saying words that surprised us both. "Bring him here." The decision wasn't about Harold, not really. It was about the woman I had become, the person who had learned that love wasn't about keeping score or demanding payment for old debts. It was about choosing compassion over bitterness, grace over justice. When they brought Harold to my house 3 days later, I barely recognized him. The proud, confident man who had once commanded every room he entered was now frail and frightened, his once dark hair white and thin, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. "Margaret," he whispered when he saw me, his voice cracked and uncertain. "Is it really you?" "Yes, Harold," I said quietly. "I'm here." He began to cry then, tears of relief and regret streaming down his hollow cheeks. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry for everything. I was such a fool. Such a terrible fool." As I helped him settle into the hospital bed we had set up in my living room, as I arranged his medications and adjusted his pillows, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Not satisfaction at his reduced circumstances, not vindication for old wounds, but a deep, quiet peace that comes from doing what is right simply because it is right. Caring for Harold these past 6 months has been one of the most difficult and transformative experiences of my life. Not because the physical demands are overwhelming, though they are considerable, but because it has forced me to confront truths I had spent decades avoiding. The Harold I tend to now is not the man who left me 43 years ago. That man was proud, selfish, driven by appetites and ambitions he couldn't control. This Harold is frightened, grateful, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. Sometimes, in his clearer moments, he tells me stories about his life after our divorce. The disappointments, the failed business ventures, the gradual realization that the grass he thought was greener on the other side was just a different shade of brown. "Linda left me when the money ran out," he told me one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just like I left you when things got hard. I thought I was so smart, so entitled to happiness. I was just selfish." He speaks often of regret, of the choices he made and the life he threw away. But I have learned that regret, while natural, is also a luxury I can no longer afford. I am 75 years old and I have lived too full a life to waste time dwelling on what might have been. The secret I mentioned at the beginning of this story, the truth that has taken me a lifetime to understand, is this: love is not about deserving. Love is not a reward for being perfect or a prize for meeting someone else's expectations. Love, real love, is a choice we make every day, sometimes in spite of everything that logic and hurt and disappointment tell us. Harold never deserved my forgiveness. He certainly doesn't deserve my care now. But I am not giving him these gifts because he has earned them. I am giving them because I have learned that the person who benefits most from grace is the one who offers it. Taking care of Harold has not healed our broken marriage. It has not erased the years of pain his abandonment caused or vindicated the choices he made. But it has completed something in me that I didn't even know was unfinished. It has proven to myself that I am capable of loving without condition, of caring without expectation of return, of choosing compassion even when justice would be easier. In his lucid moments, Harold marvels at my decision to take him in. "Why?" he asks me repeatedly. "After everything I did, why would you do this?" The answer has taken me months to understand fully. I do this because the woman I became after he left me, the strong, independent, capable woman who survived cancer and built a meaningful life from the ashes of her dreams, that woman is not motivated by bitterness or revenge. She is motivated by love, not for Harold as he was, but for the sacred dignity of human life, for the chance to transform suffering into meaning. Sometimes his children visit, bringing their own children, grandchildren Harold barely knows. I watch him try to connect with them, see the regret in his eyes as he realizes how much life he missed while chasing his version of happiness. His son is polite but distant. Sarah is warmer, grateful, but I can see she struggles to reconcile the father she knew with the broken man in my living room. "He talks about you constantly," she told me last week. "About what you were like when you were young, about the life you had together before everything fell apart. I think he finally understands what he lost. But here's what I want you to understand, dear friends who have listened to my story. This is not about what Harold lost. This is about what I found. I found that I am capable of love without limits, of strength without hardness, of forgiveness without forgetting. I discovered that the girl who once needed a man to complete her had grown into a woman who was already whole. Harold will not recover from his illness. The doctors have made that clear. But in these final months of his life, he has found peace, comfort, and unconditional care from the woman he once thought wasn't enough. And I have found something even greater: the unshakable knowledge that I am exactly who I was meant to be. The woman who was once abandoned for being too weak has become someone's final source of strength. The woman who was left behind for not being able to create life has become the person who makes Harold's remaining life bearable. There is poetry in this, a kind of divine symmetry that speaks to the mysterious ways life teaches us its most important lessons. I am not sharing this story to encourage anyone to take back someone who has hurt them. I am sharing it because I want you to know that our greatest pain can become our greatest teacher, that the people who leave us create space for us to discover who we really are, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are the quietest ones. When Harold takes his final breath, and it will be soon, I will hold his hand not as his ex-wife, not as a woman seeking closure or revenge, but as one human being offering comfort to another in the mystery of dying. And I will know that I have lived a life worthy of the love I was always capable of giving, whether it was returned or not. If my story has touched your heart, please subscribe. Life has a way of revealing the truth in its own time, and sometimes, the quietest victories are the most powerful.